Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from my backyard in beautiful Los Angeles, California. How is everyone today? I hope you're well. I hope you're happy and healthy and having some fun. Today, we're going to talk about an animal that many people have probably seen in the wild, especially if you live here in North America. It is not too hard to see some deer. Today, our critter chat is about the deer family. For scientists, they call them Cervids or Cervidae family. And when I was growing up, deer were one of the frequently seen wild animals that I would experience. I grew up in northern Utah, and my family would often drive up into the mountains just to kind of get some exposure to nature. And we would often vacation in places like national parks. Places like Yellowstone National Park was one of our favorites. And in those areas, we would often see mule deer. Those are deer common to the western part of the United States. And seeing the mule deer was always pretty exciting, even though I had seen hundreds of them by the time I was old enough to really know what was going on. Shortly after, or as I was growing up, I learned that elk are also a type of deer, and so is their even larger cousin, the moose. And so all three of those were animals I was fairly familiar with by the age I was like 10, and I had seen them on multiple occasions. Through the mountains of Utah, all three of those exist, and so I would see them on several times a year at least. And for a long time, I kind of thought that, like, wow, America's pretty special that we have these deer and that they're pretty cool. And then I remembered seeing on television for coverage for the Olympics that there were moose that lived in Norway. And I'm like, hey, wait a minute, they have moose over there too? And I didn't realize that moose lived almost everywhere around the globe at the northern latitudes. And I quickly learned that members of the deer family live on a big portion of the world. And that there are deer who live in lots of different types of places. So there are deer that live in forest, grasslands, mountains, deserts, swamps, tundra, and even in the tropics. Deer can be found in North and South America, throughout Europe, Asia, and even parts of Africa. So where aren't deer? Deer are not native in Australia, the surrounding islands, and in Africa south of the Sahara, and of course Antarctica, which doesn't really have any land-based animals that are there full-time. But with the deer, there is a very large family, and they vary greatly in size, although they all pretty much share a similar body shape. That shape is just vary in size quite a bit. So the largest of all deer is the moose. Moose can be 7 feet tall at the shoulder, so that's this high. That's about a foot taller than I am. They are absolutely huge animals. They can weigh in at almost 1,800 pounds for a big bull moose or a big male. I have seen them in the forest in Utah. Like I mentioned, I also saw them quite a bit in Yellowstone growing up. And I was awestruck by how huge they are. They are very, very big animals. It was many, many years later, I was actually an adult before I learned about the smallest member of the deer family. The smallest members are called poodoo, and they live in South America, and they are tiny. Adult poodoo only weigh about 20 pounds. They're only 14 inches tall. So they're just little guys. Standing next to me, they don't even come up to my knee. Poodoo are tiny, but they're absolutely adorable. And yet a poodoo and a moose actually have a lot in common, although they're very different size-wise. Their body shape is very similar, so their proportion of their head to the rest of their body, their neck to their head to the rest of their body, their little tail, their legs are typically long for most deer compared to the rest of their size, although some deer are kind of short-legged. and they look a little funny compared to their cousins. But there are 51 species in the deer family, so that's a lot of different types of deer. And I've already talked about the ones here in North America. As we go through, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of their cousins that can be found across the globe. So with deer, most species of deer, the males usually grow antlers. We sometimes call those horns, but they're defined as antlers by scientists because the difference between a horn and an antler, horns usually stay on the animal their entire life and continue to grow. Horns usually don't branch or fork at all, so it's usually kind of one line with a point at the end. Sometimes those curl back, like we talked about with the bighorn sheep. Sometimes they're spirally, like some of the different antelope. But with antlers, they fork, they branch, they're like trees. And they come out of their head, they attach to the skull with little bony plates. The antlers are actually made of a substance called keratin, which is similar to our fingernails. And it's kind of like keratin and bone that combines, and they actually lose those every year. And even the little tiny poodoo, his antlers are only like this big. They look like little toothpicks. And a moose have huge antlers that can be very, very wide. And grow quite a bit, but most deer species grow antlers. There's one exception. It's called the Chinese water deer. They don't have any antlers. Instead, they have kind of elongated teeth that they use kind of the same way that a deer would use its antlers. So what does a deer use its antlers for? Typically, it's just the males that grow them. There is a big exception to that, which is called the caribou, also known as the reindeer. In reindeer and caribou, both the male and the female grow antlers. They use their antlers a little bit to find food, especially in the wintertime for those that live in cold climates. Typically, the ones that live in cold climates are the largest members of the deer family, and they sometimes need to scrape the snow off of different areas to get down to the vegetation. Deer are completely herbivores or vegetarians. They only eat plants. Now the variety of plants they eat can vary quite a bit. Some deer like to eat grass. Some deer like to eat leaves off of bushes and trees. The moose, for example, can eat some water plants as well. And some deer can eat things called lichen, or some will eat mosses, some will eat fruits, nuts, and berries. But all deer are vegetarians. They won't eat other animals, so you don't need to worry about a deer ever eating you. That doesn't mean they can't be dangerous, because they absolutely can. And I've seen deer charge and chase people, so be careful if you're around them. Most deer are also very social and live in herds or groups. Their herds can be either a group of males and females, or just a group of females and another group of males. Sometimes it's females and their babies. Sometimes it's males and females and their babies. And sometimes they can be absolutely huge. Caribou are known as the largest herding of all deer species, and they have identified multiple herds at over 100,000 members. So great big, huge herds of caribou. Deer are typically crepuscular, so that's a big word. We've used it before on other critter chats. But what that means is that they're active at both sunrise and sunset. They sometimes take a break during the middle of the day and look for a cool spot to take a nap, and then wake up again and kind of are active again right around sunset and a little bit into the dark. Some deer are active during the night, depending on where they live and what the temperatures are like, and also what kind of predators are out and about. Typically, they will spend their waking hours when they're most active looking for food. They need to eat quite a bit, especially the big guys who eat a lot. They will spend a lot of time finding the best grass, the leaves, twigs, fruits, different things like that I mentioned. And then with deer and some of their bigger extended family members, like cows, they have what is called a four-chambered stomach. The first chamber is called the rumen, and in the rumen there's a lot of bacteria that live there naturally, that they need to help them break down the plant matter that they eat. So they'll chew their food, they swallow it, it sits in the first stomach, the rumen, for a bit and gets kind of broken down by some bacteria, and then they regurgitate it, or they bring it back up and they chew it again. That's called chewing their cud. You may have seen cows do this as well. Giraffes do it as well. Quite a few members of that bigger family of animals all do that. They're called ruminants when they do that. They regurgitate and re-chew their food. So after that, then they swallow it, then it goes through the rumen again and then passes through the rest of the digestive tract. But that is typically, if they eat a big breakfast, it will sit in the rumen for a minute, then they bring it back up, chew it during the middle of the day when they're kind of being a little more lazy and resting, and then they'll swallow it. That will finish digesting, and then they're ready to eat again, kind of during their sunset hours of feeding. So one of my favorite things about deer is the babies are absolutely adorable. Most baby deer species, there are some exceptions, but a lot of them have little white spots all over them. If you think of Bambi, Bambi's a very famous baby deer called a fawn. But they're very cute with like their little brown coat with their little white spots. Those white spots can help them hide in a forest setting where the light filters through the leaves. If you look at me right now, I have sunlight shining through a tree and landing on me. Different parts are lighter, different parts are darker, but those white spots would help them to kind of blend in. When baby deer are born, the mom usually hides them for the first week or so, and she'll come back and check in on them while she goes out and eats. She'll stay pretty close to them, and they can usually walk and follow her within a few hours, which is very important for them because there's a lot of predators that will try to eat baby deer. Depending on where they live, that could be anything from like wolves and coyotes, or things like bears, also any of the big cats around the world. Deer live in so many different environments, so sometimes in North America that's something like a lynx or a bobcat or a mountain lion. In South America, that could be a jaguar or an ocelot. In Asia, that could be a tiger or a leopard. So lots of different animals could be predators for deer. And they'll sometimes go after the adults too, depending on where they are and how big the predator is. A tiger will definitely eat deer. That's one of their main prey sources. Same with like a mountain lion. So deer have to be very mindful of predators. And living in a group, in a herd, helps them out. They can have a lot of eyes watching out for danger, and when they see something move, they will kind of alert the others and let them know that there is danger nearby. But back to baby deer. So when when the mom deer is pregnant, her gestation or pregnancy varies depending on the species between 180 up to about 240 days. So typically the ones that are pregnant longer are the bigger ones, like the moose, like the elk, and some of the big deer in Europe and Asia. Some of the smaller ones are pregnant for less time. Typically they have one baby, sometimes twins. On rare occasions there's 3 babies born to a mom, and there are accounts of 4 being born, although I have never seen that myself. I think I've seen triplets once, but it's pretty rare. Twins is more common in some species. Moose typically have 2 babies, but not always. Most deer typically have 1, but twins does happen. They're called fawns if they're kind of a medium-sized deer and smaller. If they are bigger-sized deer like elk or moose, they are sometimes called calves. I don't know why. That doesn't really make sense, but that's the way it is. So of the 51 species of deer, about half of them are either threatened or endangered. In recent times, in the last like 150 years, one species has gone extinct completely. Another species has gone extinct in the wild, and it is luckily saved because of zoos. That is called the Pierre's deer. There are still some in zoos today, and they're hoping to get them fully released back into the wild. They're making sure that their habitat is safe for them to go back. There are many other species, though, that are still threatened with endangerment and possibly becoming extinct. And there's a variety of different threats depending on where they live in the world. But the three main threats that deer species face are habitat loss. Again, the booming population of people and the need to feed people cuts down forest, cuts down grasslands where native grasses grow to grow food, to feed people. That's one of the biggest reasons. And also those that live in forest environments, as we cut down the trees, that changes where they live and sometimes eliminates their kind of food. Also, poaching and hunting of deer is a huge issue, especially with some of the endangered species. It's very hard for people who have a very hard life and don't have a lot of food. Even if they don't have a lot of money and don't have a lot of food, if they see a deer, they may want to try to shoot that deer or kill that deer for food because they are hungry and their kids are hungry and they need to try to feed their family. And they may not always care that that deer is endangered. That's still an opportunity for them for food. So that is a big problem, especially with many of the deer on some of the islands in Asia. Kind of in that southeastern Asia portion of the world, there's many deer on those islands, and each kind of island group has different species, and many of those are endangered for that reason. And then the other big reason for threats for deer is their competition for resources brought about by people having goats and cows and sheep and other domesticated animals. In some cases, that actually includes deer. The caribou has been domesticated and is called a reindeer by a lot of people in the northern countries of the world, so parts of Canada, Alaska, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Finland, and Russia all have domesticated populations of reindeer that people use for their hides, for their milk, for their meat, and to help pull things like sleighs or other tools. So sometimes even competition from what is essentially a cousin of theirs, but now people own and farm like a farm animal, can be a big threat to the wild populations. But not all deer are threatened. Certainly the species that live here in North America have fairly robust populations. In fact, that's sometimes a problem too, is that there's too many deer. Throughout much of the eastern United States, that's become a big part of the problem with the white-tailed deer who live in the eastern US. They reproduce very readily, and many of the predators in those areas have been eliminated. And so now there's way too many deer for what people want on the land, and it sometimes causes a lot of trouble with people and often causes things like car accidents as people have hit deer with their cars. That's a problem in the western US as well, places with mule deer that have become very rampant, and especially with elk. Elk are a very large deer, can weigh over 1,000 pounds for a big male, and they can quickly become overpopulated in areas. There's a big area in Colorado right near Rocky Mountain National Park, which is a protected space where elk have thrived because there hasn't been hunting there, but there's also not a lot of predators in that area. And so the surrounding area has been impacted greatly by having too many elk on the land, and it's starting to hurt a lot of the vegetation, particularly some of the trees in the area have been overeaten by the elk. That's also was a population problem in Yellowstone. The elk population was way past what the ecosystem could safely accommodate because there weren't enough predators out there eating the elk. When they introduced wolves about 25 years ago, that made a big change and started to change the elk numbers, and with wolves being back in place, that has greatly impacted the balance of the ecosystem. Balance in nature is very important, And if you have too many prey species and not enough predators, it throws everything else off. There's really good videos I shared back when I did the Critter Chat about wolves, about the importance of bringing wolves back. In the state of Colorado that is having an overpopulation of elk right now, that is actually a measure on their political ballot coming up for November, is the possibility of bringing wolves back to the state of Colorado. I personally support that idea. I think that having a balance with predators and prey is very important in nature, and that could help out their overpopulation of elk quite a bit. So I would support that. If you're in Colorado, please read into that, research it carefully, and then vote according to how you think that could best work out. So let's talk a little bit about my experiences with the deer family. Like I said, when I was growing up, we saw deer quite often on family vacations. Mule deer lived just a couple of miles from where I grew up. I would sometimes see them in the foothills, or we would see them on along the freeway as we would drive to visit my grandparents. So mule deer were something I would see often. If we went into the mountains, we would see elk fairly often. And on occasion, we would see moose. Moose were rare in Utah, but they were still there. So we would see them on occasion. I remember one time we were up in the mountains and we were with my brother, and he had a good friend and her brothers and sisters. We were all hanging out for the day up in the mountains on some property that their family owned. And we were just kind of having a picnic and playing around. And we heard something coming through the forest. And they luckily had built a tree house on part of their property. And as this big sound came crashing down the forest, we scrambled up the tree house. And it's a good thing we did, because it was two bull moose who were not very happy we were there. And they came charging down towards us. We luckily got up in the treehouse and kind of waited them out. We stayed up there until they moved off because they didn't seem too happy that we were there. In Yellowstone National Park, I've been there multiple times during the year, but especially in the early fall when it's the beginning of the breeding season, also known as the rut for the elk. It can be quite a dangerous place. Elk can get very defensive about their babies. Mom elk can be very defensive, and even though they don't have the antlers, they can still use their sharp hoofs to kick you, and they're still a very big animal that could run you over pretty easily. But during the breeding season, the males make this very loud sound. They call it bugling. I cannot impersonate it, so I'm not going to try. But it's a very beautiful sound, but it helps bring female elk to where the male elk are, and it also lets other males know that there's a male around, and he may want to challenge or fight with other males in the area for breeding rights. That is a very interesting time to watch elk. It's a very highly active time for them, but it can be a very dangerous time, and I have seen people charged by elk during that time, so it can be a little bit crazy. So always be safe if you're around large animals who are very focused on one thing, and you may be in their way. So especially with big animals like elk, that would be their fall time when they're breeding. I've also seen been in Yellowstone in the spring, and I've seen baby deer, I've seen baby elk, I've seen baby moose, and it's always been a great thing to see. I've ventured up to Alaska, where I have seen wild caribou, which was exciting. Did see a couple of moms with some babies. We did not see any amazingly huge herds, but it was great to see caribou out in their wild habitat. Now, all of the species that kind of live in North America, the moose, caribou, elk, mule deer, white-tailed deer, I've seen all of those. They're all good size. They're pretty big. Even an adult white-tailed deer is still usually over 100 pounds, so that's still a pretty big size animal. So I always thought most deer would be big like that. When I became a zookeeper, I learned that there's many, many deer that are actually quite small. At the Los Angeles Zoo, I helped take care of 3 different species of deer. One of those was the smallest deer in the world, which are called poodoo. which come from South America. They are listed as near threatened. Their population is declining, and like I mentioned earlier, they only weigh 20 pounds as an adult. They're only 14 inches tall. Baby poodoo typically don't even weigh quite a pound. They're just like this big. They're super adorable. I have some photos. Even the adults are adorable because they're so little. I have some photos I'll post later today about the poodoo. I also worked with a species of deer from China called the Chinese tufted deer. They're kind of a charcoaly gray color. The male just gets little tiny antlers, but he also has little fangs or teeth that stick out the bottom of his mouth. Very interesting deer. They live in the forested mountains of China. I was getting a phone call in the middle of this from somebody in Indonesia. I don't know why they were calling me. That's very strange. But I don't need to take that call. So back to deer. I also worked with an incredible species of deer, and the photo I posted earlier today on Facebook and Instagram is me working with a species of deer called a Calamian deer. Now, you've probably never heard of this deer. You've probably never seen this deer. That kind of deer only lives at 2 zoos in the United States currently. It used to also be at the San Diego Zoo, but they no longer have them. Or it may have been at the safari park, but they no longer have them either. So those deer only live at the Los Angeles Zoo, and I believe the Phoenix Zoo still has them. Last I knew they did. But of those deer, they have not done very well in captivity. So there are, to my knowledge, 5 deer left in the United States that are Calamian deer. They are native to the Philippines. They only live on a select group of islands in the Philippines called the Calamian Islands. They kind of live in some grasslands that are very near the coast. On the biggest of the islands that they live on, it is assumed that they are no longer there at all. They have kind of been eaten and hunted by the local people, but also with our warming world and the sea levels rising, many of the grasslands near the edge of the island have been flooded by rising sea levels, and it has killed off the kind of grass that the deer like to eat. And so on many of the islands, they are now having a hard time finding enough food. There are still some islands where there are deer living, and there is a conservation park that has some deer there. But unfortunately, when they tried to start a breeding population in US zoos, it did not work out very well. And although it lasted for a number of years and we did have some babies born, even during the time I was working with them, there are no longer any female Calamian deer living in the United States. So unfortunately, that does not look very good for them and the captive population here. Now, there are some organizations in the Philippines trying to do some work to save them, but the Philippines actually has 3 species of deer and they are all endangered. So money is kind of thin to help them out. And the Philippines as a country struggles with a lot of different things. They have a huge population. They don't have a lot of wealth or income coming in. And they sometimes have a lot of really crazy natural disasters. Things like hurricanes, tsunamis, flooding, fires have all caused problems in recent years, and unfortunately that doesn't leave a lot of hope for conservation efforts. But there are some people doing some really great work, including my former employer, the Los Angeles Zoo, who has supported conservation efforts to help support many deer across the world, but specifically the 3 that I worked with there at the zoo. I hope you've enjoyed what I've shared with you today about deer. I'll be posting some more things later today on the Facebook and the Instagram. So check those out as they come up later on. And yeah, until tomorrow, take care, be happy, be healthy, stay safe. We'll see you. Bye.